But if we think of the current environment, my call to courage might be about, career transition, for instance. So if my call to courage is, I am going to transition my career, I can then look at braving and think about how do I build trust with myself to be able to do that.
I'm Renata Bernarde, a career coach and the host of the Job Hunting Podcast. The goal of this podcast is to support and educate you in the steps you need to take to find great jobs, change and advance your career with confidence and less stress. So make sure you subscribe and follow, and welcome aboard. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Job Hunting Podcast. In this episode, we are interviewing Dina Pozzo. Now, I've wanted to have Dina as a guest of the podcast ever since COVID-19 started, because Dina's research and expertise is courage. And last year she hosted the Courage Conference here in Melbourne, and I attended, and that's how we met. I met many of her clients. They were very appreciative and fond of the work that she does for them. She works with large corporations here in Melbourne. And I was very excited then when she accepted the invitation to be a guest of the podcast. We discussed courage in the context of job hunting and also workplace, what courage looks like in the workplace and what lack of courage looks like in the workplace. So I think it's a very important topic as you are going through the grieving process of maybe having lost your job, or if you're making plans for your future employment, to make courage in the workplace something to aim for in the future. Now, we have been focusing a lot on COVID-19 topics at this time, of course, for obvious reasons. There are many of us that will be out of job in 2020 and looking for work in the months ahead. So if you go to my website and you look on the right-hand side of the website, you can search by topic, and one of the topics is now COVID series. And if you click on that, you will find not only the job hunting podcasts that have been done specifically for this time of our lives, but also the live coaching sessions that I do. So I launch a weekly episode of the Job Hunting Podcast every Tuesdays. It used to be Thursdays. I moved it to Tuesdays. And every Thursday now I have a live coaching session, which I film live on Facebook and Instagram. I record it, and then it's available on my website as well. And I tend to focus on topics that are, important at this point in time, questions that I've been asked that I think are relevant for more than one person, and I address them at these live coaching sessions on Facebook and Instagram, and they're archived for you to have a look as well. This podcast is available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, YouTube, and also on my website. So if you want to follow and subscribe, I will be super happy to have you on board every week. And more so if you decide to subscribe to my newsletter, because if you do so, I will send you the podcast every week, the recording of the live coaching every week, and also a curated list of articles to help you with your career plans. So consider subscribing to the newsletter. I think it's a great thing for you to do for your career, and it keeps us both connected more so. So enjoy this episode with Dina Pozzo. I hope you find it helpful. Leave me comments, send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in participating, sending ideas for future topics, I'm all ears. Be sure to keep connected. Bye for now. So how are you doing during COVID? What's your day like?
My work day is actually quite full. It's really interesting. To begin with, all the work was taken out of my diary. And what I mean by that, all the work that I had planned was stopped, and understandably so. But what's probably happened in the last 3 weeks or so, clients are now reconnecting and saying, okay, we actually want to try things, virtually. Mm-hmm. And so, look, my typical day is we walk the dogs every single morning. We're now walking them for about an hour and a half in the morning, get started on some work, have a little break, take the dogs for another walk, come back, do more work. So it's a fairly full day. And it's actually becoming really interesting because, as I said, more clients are wanting virtual connections and virtual sessions. I'm spending a lot of time working in the space of well-being and how do we remain well at this time.
Okay. And are these sessions for employers? So are they group sessions?
Yeah, group sessions.
Right.
Some of them have been more successful than others.
I see.
Technology is interesting.
Okay. So you mean in terms of technology or in terms of the culture?
The technology. And
Okay.
clearly the technology impacts everything else. But just,
Right.
the technology provides its challenges.
Yes, okay. And, I'd love for you to describe to everybody the work that you do, because you have a finger in a few pies, and I'd rather you explain than me try to.
Oh, thank you, Renata. Probably the easiest way to give you a broad overview. I work in the space of leadership and teams development and also executive coaching. So I work with organisations, whether they're large, small, medium organisations, whether they're corporate or not-for-profit. And my purpose, I'm really clear on what my purpose is, which has been very helpful. My purpose is to open doors. And what I mean by that is sometimes we have firmly and intentionally shut some doors. Sometimes we've wandered past doors and not even noticed them. And clearly there'll be doors in our future. So in my practice, whether it's coaching or in group facilitation, I encourage people to courageously open their doors and to explore what's on the other side. And whether they're doors of the past, current or future, we may not like everything we always find, but it's just about at least exploring it and honouring it. We can't change our past, but we can learn from it.
And what led you to finding that purpose and focusing on it?
Okay, it must be now 6 or 7 years ago. I was at a little bit of a crossroads in terms of what next. I've been in my own business, in my own practice for 15 years. And at that time, 6 or 7 years ago, I was just thinking, what do I do now? Where do I go? And so I actually headed over to the US to participate in a program which was called Authentic Leadership. And the whole purpose of the program was to distill your own purpose. Mm-hmm. And then as a result of distilling your own purpose, to actually operationalise it. So actually come up with action plans to put into place. And that's where it became really crystal clear what I wanted to do and where I wanted to focus.
Okay. But you've been doing your own consultancy for quite some time. Yes. Were you able to, I'm as a consultant and a business owner myself, I'm curious, were you able to transition your clients and your work into this new purpose? Were you able to just remain with that clientele, or did you have to move into a different area of operations?
Yeah,
consultancy?
Really good question. I would say 90% of my clients came with me at the time because it was about repositioning with them what my passion was. And it was about repositioning with them what would bring me energy, which then allowed me to be the best possible version of myself for them.
Yeah.
And one of the things I pride myself on, Renata, is keeping in touch, and keeping in touch purposefully, not just for the sake of, hi, how are you? And so I think that's one of my strengths. And so my clients at the time knew me, trusted me. I was part of their teams internally. So I'd say probably 90% of my clients came with me at the time, and it was just about repositioning.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because that's a very important topic of my podcast and life coaching, is that idea of keeping in touch. And I have always been what I I call myself a calling street girl.
Oh,
you know, Calling Street, for those who are listening from overseas or outside of Melbourne, is the main business hub of Melbourne, CBG, the where all of the big buildings are, and I'm usually walking up and down Calling Street to go to meetings. We have to translate that virtually now, don't we? So I've pulled out my online course, and I'm redoing some of the modules to translate that networking and that the importance of remaining top of mind with your network virtually, and how to do so, how to translate leadership in Zoom meetings, and how to position yourself. There's a lot out there about how to present on Zoom, but it's more than that. It's the narrative, it's a different type of body language and a different type of engagement.
Yes, absolutely. Definitely.
Okay. But the way that we met was really lovely, because it was a conference that you organized here in Melbourne focused on courage. Was it Courage to Lead? Courage?
We just called it Courage Conference. It was the first Courage Conference in Australia, so we thought we'd keep it simple.
Yes. And I thought that would be a great topic for us to unpack for the listeners of this podcast, who are job seekers, who are in between jobs, who are maybe currently have a job but are very interested in their careers and in developing and advancing in their careers. So they could be looking at promotions, they could be starting to position themselves for future job hunting, and taking that leap into it requires courage. I also, as a coach that works with executives that are trying to come out of organizations or are already out of organizations, I have dealt with issues of courage. You mentioned, and I want you to unpack things like moral courage and how to deal with in work environments that have a lack of courage, and how does that translate so that people can, listening to your examples and stories, kind of go, that's why it was so hard for me. Yeah. So why don't we start by defining courage? That would be great.
Okay. A really big question, because there are many, many definitions of courage, and our definitions of courage have evolved over time. And I'm talking about definitions of courage go way back to the ancient Greek philosophers. Our definitions of courage have evolved over time as society has valued different aspects of courage, and as society's values have also changed. So there are still many definitions of courage out there, and we can look at, courage includes, and we can go into detail about this if you would like, it includes physical courage, it includes vital courage, it includes moral courage that you mentioned. Psychologists such as Chris Peterson and Marty Seligman talk about courage as a virtue under which 4 different strengths sit. And then we've got our definition of courage, which is based on my study and based on a review of the literature, as well as my own experience in organisations. And this is terrible, but I can't give you the whole thing verbatim.
That's okay. I've read your definition of courage, and I will add it to the episode show notes.
Right.
And I'll make sure that when we promote the podcast, it's there as a quote.
Thank you, Renata. Thank you.
But maybe, just do your best. I'm sure you can manage.
I can give you the key words. And the reason, so there's one key word in particular, which I'll come back to, but key words in our definition of workplace courage are intentional, it's a moral or a constructive act, and there's a degree of risk either to the individual, to the team, to the organisation, and it's to either avert or resolve a workplace issue. Mm-hmm. Now, the word that is really, really important for me is the intentional piece. Yes. Because courage is a spiritual strength that sits in the middle of a continuum. And at this end of the continuum, and it's quite a way away, we have cowardice. And at this end of the continuum, we have recklessness. So we have intentionally put the word intentional in our definition because that means that you have stopped and thought about the act that you're about to embark on. And if you stop and think about it and reflect on it, and it might be a couple of minutes, it might be a day, whatever the case is, but if you've stopped and reflected, you're more likely to sit in courage rather than tip into cowardice or recklessness. And there are 3 questions that we encourage you to reflect on. And if I give you an example, and perhaps the example is about applying for a new role in the current environment. So the first question I would ask you to consider is, how worthwhile is that action? And we also suggest a quantitative scale from 1 to 5, where 1 is not at all worthwhile and 5 is extremely worthwhile. So how worthwhile is it? And that question should conjure up a number of different reflection questions for you depending on the situation. So if I think of applying for a new role in the current environment, how worthwhile is it? Well, okay, COVID-19, yes, that's out of my control. But in the current environment, I may be unhappy in my current organisation. I might be frustrated by a lack of autonomy in the work from home situation, whatever it might be. So a whole heap of other questions might come up that help me answer the worthwhile piece. The second question we'd like you to reflect upon is, how risky is it to apply for that role? Again, not at all risky to very risky, and you'd consider that. And then based on those 2 deliberations, the third question we ask you to consider is, what action will you take? So if I stop and think of those 3 things, it's more likely to keep me encouraged, as I said, rather than tip me over here or here. The thing I need to be really clear about, sometimes it takes courage to do nothing, to not act. And the other thing I really need to be clear about is, what I may need courage for, you may not, and vice versa. So it's a very subjective thing.
Yes, no, these are all very good points, especially in the workplace, and in the way that some people may deal with news of, let's say, restructures and redundancies, with the news of going under administration or having to lock down. And some people may we talk a lot about anxiety and stress, and we use those words maybe because it's very hard for us to kind of go deeper into understanding what's happening. But I think courage is a great way of thinking about it, especially when we think about decisions that the leaders are having to take.
Yes.
And then, of course, there is that input as policy levers and big decisions, and then the output, the courage from the people that are on the receiving end of those decisions, those big decisions, and then what they do about it and how they react. In my experience working with people that are in career transition, what I have found, however, is that there is a big issue of inertia. People have dreamed and romanticized about changing careers for decades, and they haven't, because they probably, without even thinking much, they look at that scale of the risk and the benefits and the costs of moving, and they think, oh well, life is okay here, and I don't know if I am courageous or brave enough to actually take this leap and change my career or change my life. What COVID has done now is just taking you out of that comfort zone to the point where you have to be brave. How would you then, what would you say to people that have not chosen to be brave. I mean, you mentioned intentional, right?
Yeah.
But now here we all are. How do we unpack this?
One of the things that we encourage you to do, and it's really curious that courage is part of the word encourage, is to reflect on when you've been courageous in the past. And anytime I make that statement, people go, oh, but I've never been courageous. What's really curious, we've done a number of interviews over the last 2 years, and everyone I've interviewed has exactly said that, oh, I've never been courageous. And then we stop and we unpack. And I just ask questions about, well, when has there been a risk in the past? When have you felt vulnerable in the past? What did you do? When were you proud of something you did in the past? And what we find when we unpack those kind of questions, and I will sit and listen as we do, and I will say, wow, there's courage. And people go, oh. And they go, you're right. So if we stop and think and unpack the past, we can see when we've been courageous in the past, we can see what we did, how we did it, how we felt, who enabled us, all those things. And then effectively what we're doing is we're collecting metadata on ourselves to then be able to apply in future when we need to be courageous again. And I'll use an example. Paul Kennedy is a journalist on the ABC, and I interviewed him, it must be 2 years ago now, I think. And I was just asking him about some of the stories that he's reported on and written. And, he said to me, I'm not at all courageous. And I reflected back to him some of his stories. And he said, and this is the other thing that people say, but that's my job. It's what I do. And in unpacking that as well, I've then asked, well, why do you do that? And then it's always tied to values. So again, if we can think of when our values have really risen and come to the fore and unpack those stories, we can then actually find out instances in the past where we've been courageous. So it's even with Paul, when I said, there's courage, he went, oh, you're right. So it happens every single time. And I'm a big advocate of people being courage spotters. So when you spot courage in someone else, to call it out, because that helps build our self-awareness. And then,
and can you practice courage? Is courage something that you can practice and enhance? I mean, spotting is a great idea. Identifying it in the past is another one. Can you also, is it like a muscle that you can train?
Absolutely. So, Renata, I'm not sure if you know, I was accredited by Dr. Brene Brown in her work, Dare to Lead. Yes. So Brene talks about 4 key skills of courage. 1 is rumbling with vulnerability, 2 is living your values, 3 is braving trust, and the 4th skill is learning to rise, which is all about building your resilience. So in understanding those skills, you can then put plans into practice to build courage and to be more courageous. Okay. Definitely.
Okay. So how can you give an example of something that somebody could do if they are in between jobs and, trying to boost their courage to go out there in the job market again and reconnect with networks that they have, that this person may have neglected for a decade or so? You need a little bit of courage to do that. How can you boost yourself up?
So there's a number of ways. The first thing that comes to mind is to sit with that sense of vulnerability. Because if I'm thinking I haven't connected with my network for years, I may also, and I'm making assumptions here clearly, but I may also be thinking, oh, if I connect with them now, what are they going to think? I haven't, what reason am I going to use to connect with them now? And there's the risk. What if they don't return my call? What if they don't respond to the email I send? What if? So there's a risk. So clearly with that risk comes courage. And clearly with that risk, there may be that sense of vulnerability. And vulnerability, put really, really simply, is that discomfort, the emotion we feel when we're thinking we're about to embark on something and there's no guarantee of outcome. So the first thing I would suggest is sit with that vulnerability and know that vulnerability is actually strength. You know, sometimes there's a few myths around vulnerability, and one of them is that vulnerability is a weakness. But when you think about it, reconnecting with a network that potentially I haven't spoken to in a little while, applying for a new job, transitioning my career, having a conversation with my current leader to say, I'm not happy in my current role. That's on the work front. On the personal front, you know, building a relationship with someone new, deciding to start a family, saying I love you first. You know, might there be discomfort? Might it even feel awkward? Yeah, absolutely. But that's not weakness, that's strength. That's actually showing up and being seen. That's actually saying, this is what's important to me. That's actually saying, this is okay, this isn't okay. So actually to sit with that vulnerability and know that acting on it is actually a real strength. And what we know is courage is contagious. So then someone else might go, oh, if she can do that, perhaps I can too.
Yes, I agree with both things. Of course I do. I mean, there's enough research that shows that. But the idea of vulnerability in the job hunting world is such an important one.
Yeah.
People make so many excuses not to apply for jobs because the excuses are all, you know, out there. But the truth is, it makes you really, really vulnerable when you do apply. And chances are you're not going to get it. This is what I always tell my clients. You know, this is a practice. We're going to practice. We're going to get data and feedback, and we're going to improve your game, and then you're going to nail it.
Yes.
But you need to get into that vulnerability. And it's really, really tough, especially for the type of clients that I have, which are more senior execs and have you know, a lot of experience under their belt. It's a completely different muscle that you have to use when you're doing job hunting.
And Renata, with that too, sometimes it's about building trust with yourself.
Okay.
So trust is one of the other skills that Brene speaks about based on her research. And she's come up with the acronym BRAVING. And what I love about this acronym in terms of building trust is that it's actually made trust very tangible and demystified it, because, you know, again, trust is this beautiful strength, but it's also a little bit mysterious. If, you know, we talk about, I trust this person, I don't trust that person, or whatever we say, but what does that mean? And so Brene's come up with this 7-letter acronym BRAVING, and, you know, there's more information on her website around it, but basically BRAVING stands for boundaries, reliability, accountability, the vault, integrity, non-judgment, and generosity. And in terms of building trust, you can actually choose the elements that are most important in a particular relationship. So rather than kind of thinking, I don't trust this person, well, what is it? Is it because you haven't set boundaries with each other? Is it because you don't think they're accountable? Is it because integrity is an issue, whatever it might be? And you can actually work on specifics. Now, just as you can use this acronym to build trust with other people, you can actually use the same acronym to build trust with yourself. And I'll give you a for instance. When I was in the States being accredited by Brene, you know, she took us through the acronym, and as a facilitator, I was sitting there thinking, oh, you know, she's now going to ask us to identify someone and apply it. And sure enough, she asked us to apply it, but she said, I want you to apply it to yourself. And I sat there, Renata, and I went, oh.
You weren't expecting that at all, were you?
No. And I found it really confronting.
Yes.
But also, and I'll give you the short version of the story, it took me a long time to do it, but when I finally did it, there was this amazing sense of relief, because what she had us do was apply BRAVING to our call to courage. And my call to courage was about having a more balanced work life. But if we think of the current environment, my call to courage might be about, career transition, for instance. So if my call to courage is, I am going to transition my career, I can then look at braving and think about how do I build trust with myself to be able to do that. And it could be, and again, clearly I'm making this up because it would be different for different people, but it could be about holding myself to account. If I've kind of said, okay, I am going to transition my career and, in the next 6 months, I am going to, with Renata's help, I'm going to apply for at least 3 roles out of my current sector or out of my current organisation, whatever it might be, in 6 months. And then it's about keeping myself to account for that. It could be the boundaries. Well, what boundaries am I going to set around that? Well, I'm only going to apply in this sector, or I'm only going to apply for these roles, and I'm not going to apply if a job comes up that I think is quasi interesting. If it's outside of this type of role, I'm not going to apply.
Okay.
So you can use braving to build trust with yourself to help you achieve your call to courage, whatever that call to courage might be.
I wonder how courage fits into this idea of focusing on strengths rather than weaknesses, which always also comes from positive psychology and the whole Martin Seligman thing. Because what you want is for, as a career coach, what I want for my clients is for them to focus on their strengths. How would I'm just sort of, I went into this sort of tangent of thinking that maybe courage is taking them away from their strengths a little bit and opening up their horizons to look at things that they would normally not consider their strengths. What do you think about that?
Good thinking. My head's kind of gone in all different directions.
And I think while you think, I think the reason why I'm kind of torn and this COVID situation has made us think about, our paradigms and the way that we always define things and coach things a certain way. But especially if you think about clients that have a huge strength in working in a specific sector, that's all they've done all their lives. They've worked in the airline sector. They moved from Sydney Airport to Qantas, to Virgin Airlines, to whatever, always not as pilots, but as HR directors or operational CFOs, COOs. That's their strength. Their strength is really understanding how that industry works. And now here we are with the sector completely disappeared, and they need to it affects not only their strengths, but also their status quo, their ability to convey a message in a way that's understood by somebody from a completely different industry.
So I suppose, Renata, what's going on in my head is, based on the work of Seligman and all the positive psychologists out there, is when I think of a strength in knowledge of an industry, I think of that as a capability, a competency. So I have industry knowledge, I have knowledge of, whether it's that HR director or CFO or wherever it might be. So I have competency and capability in an industry in a particular role. If we think of strengths as those things that help us flourish, it's about, for me then, it's about using those strengths, and I'm actually picturing the graph that I use when I explain this, and that's why I'm doing this and this. Sorry, I speak with my hands.
That's okay.
I'm thinking of all the strengths that we use that help us flourish, that are outside of our competencies and capabilities, and how do we engage those strengths potentially in a different sector. So if I think, for instance, let's say I was that person who was that HR director in the airline industry, perhaps I have the strength of curiosity. So how can I use that strength of curiosity to find out about a different sector? and then apply myself that way. I might have the strength of, I'm trying to think of another strength.
No, I'm going to follow your lead on that, because I think that that's a great cue for me, and also for the listeners, if they have done the strengths test from the happiness website, and they know what their strengths are. So for me, for example, is love of learning is my top strength. So if you have that strength, well, it has always been easier for me to transition from, one sector to another anyway. I've done that in my career. And I have taken, in the past, I this is me. I'm such a dork. I get excited about applying for a role because it will teach me about an organization and a sector that I don't know. So I'm, such a student that I take that as an assignment. And if I don't get the job, that doesn't matter, because for that week that I have applied for that role, I will have learned so much about that organization. It will stay with me forever. So that's part of my coaching as well. I teach people how to be like that. But now that in listening to you, I'm thinking I need to have my clients do the strengths test, and then I can then, with that result, help them build their courage.
Absolutely.
The leap that they need to do.
And know also in the VIA strengths, you've got the 4 strengths that sit under the virtue of courage. And those 4 strengths are authenticity and honesty, perseverance, zest or energy, and I've just gone blank. Oh, bravery. Yes. Well. Yeah. So there's those strengths that are amongst the VIA strengths, and we know with the VIA strengths that we actually have all of the strengths. We just express them to different degrees, and hence we have, the top 5 or 6 strengths, which are our signature strengths, and then the other strengths. So even wherever the strengths under courage, wherever they sit in your 24, you can actually, you do demonstrate them, but just to a different degree.
Yes. And the fact that you mentioned that courage is contagious is a great one, because you may not have those strengths up there, but if people around you have them, you pick it up as a cough. It's courage is not a pill you take. It's like the cough. You catch it, don't you? And absolutely. I have seen that happen. So it's really great. And you can see that a lot in the workplace. So I'd love for us to kind of, for this tail end of our conversation, to move away from job hunting and into workplace courage, because I think a lot of people will relate to some of the examples that I've heard you talk about before. I was hoping that you would tell this new audience that may not have heard you before, talk about what courage looks like in the workplace and what the absence of courage looks like in the workplace as well.
Absolutely. So again, we need to be mindful that what I deem to be courageous and what I need courage for, you may not, and vice versa. But courage in the workplace looks like lots of different things. It may look like speaking up in a meeting. It may look like giving someone feedback. It may be deciding that I'm going to, in the current environment, if offices start to open up again, courage may be actually saying, I'd like to continue to work from home. Courage in the workplace might be actually having work-life balance. Courage might be bringing a new idea to the team. So, and the list goes on. We've put together a questionnaire, Renata, that has something like 35 different workplace situations that require courage, and that list is not exhaustive. Courage in the workplace may actually be when you see a group of colleagues go to have lunch together. And courage may actually be going up to that group of colleagues and saying, do you mind if I join you for lunch? So there are lots of different instances where courage may be required in the workplace. In the absence of courage, and this is based on the research by Brene, in the absence of courage, we don't speak about our feelings and fears because we're concerned about what people might do with that knowledge. But in the absence of speaking about our feelings and fears, we actually find ourselves spending an inordinate amount of time managing bad performance. We don't give feedback, And what we find, instead of speaking to people, we speak about them, which is totally unfair. Trust is corroded. We don't innovate because we're concerned about making mistakes and how that will be perceived. We get stuck in problem solving, which you may think, well, that's a good thing. But we do it at the expense of actually identifying the cause of the problem. And there's actually a quote out there by Einstein which goes something like, if I had 60 minutes to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes in problem identification and 5 minutes in solving it. What else? In the absence of courage, we're so concerned of doing or saying something wrong that we don't do anything. And I'm talking particularly around inclusion and diversity and equity. We're so concerned about saying the wrong thing, we don't say anything at all. And so we're actually, by our lack of action, we're being exclusive and we're not being diverse. We look towards perfectionism, and we know perfectionism is actually intricately tied to anxiety, which you mentioned earlier, and depression. So there's some of the things that happen in the absence of courage in the workplace.
Are you watching what's happening with COVID? And yesterday, it's not up available yet, but I interviewed Sandy. Do you know Sandy Hutchinson from Career Money Life?
No.
She's the former partner at Mercer, HR partner at Mercer, and she has an outplacement platform that is used by many large clients going through restructures. And she's forecasting more restructures to come out. That we already have way more restructures than we've ever had before. The scale and the pace is much higher now during COVID, and she's forecasting more restructures to come. How would that affect, do you think, courage in the workplace? You would expect and want people to be more courageous because it's such a new reality that those new ideas and conversations and problem solving are so important. But also on the flip side of that, people might be scared of raising their voice because they might lose their jobs.
Absolutely. And again, it's about sitting with that vulnerability. And one of the big takeouts that I took from Brene's work was what's okay, what's not okay. And so having voice and actually being able to say, this is okay and this isn't. Now, tying that to your values. If you come back to your values every time, when you reach that fork in the road, we know whatever the decision that needs to be made, do I go this way or do I go that way, is going to be an easier decision to make. I'm not saying it's going to be an easy decision, but it will be easier. So if we tap into our values and sit with the discomfort, but know that that discomfort, that vulnerability is actually a strength, we're more likely to speak up. We're more likely to give feedback, on what the restructure or how the restructure might impact. Now, please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying any of this is easy.
Yes. And it is a privilege sometimes, isn't it? I mean, we speak from a place of privilege.
Yes.
Where, we lose our jobs in Australia. We have job seekers. Yes. We have a safety net. Yes. My podcast is listened in many parts of the world where that privilege doesn't exist. Yeah. So it's very hard to speak up. Having said that, people do all the time. Yeah. It's amazing. And, so amazing.
And again, I come back to, what I don't want people to walk away from today is, well, I'm just going to go out there and speak up. I come back to intentional, stop, reflect. How worthwhile is it to speak up? What's the risk associated with speaking up? And then as a result, what will I do? And there's no magic answers there. There's no magic formula. But if we stop and think about it, we're more likely, again, to sit in courage. And remember, sometimes it takes courage to do nothing. The other thing to really remember is we're not on our own. Sometimes this is, this is something that I tend to do, which I'm trying really hard not to. Another myth around vulnerability is that, I can go it alone. And I know that when I'm feeling my most vulnerable, I tend to shut people out. And that's probably the worst thing I can do, because these are people who love me, who support me, who want me to succeed, who want to be there for me. We are neurobiologically wired to connect. And if we think we can go it alone, we're actually pushing against our own neurobiology. So, and I need to listen to myself when I say this and take my own advice. Connect with people who are going to give you strength. Connect with people who can even give you a perspective on those 3 questions. You know, you can have a conversation with, is it worthwhile? What's the risk associated? And when I say connect with people who aren't going to tell you just what you want to hear, but are actually people who want you to succeed, and so are going to be honest with you and give you a perspective that you find valuable.
Yes. Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that. You know, I mean, this is the reason why I have so much free content out there, is because, you know, for years I've been doing career coaching. I've been very lucky to always have a client working with me. Now I have more because this is a big project for me now. But the amount of people that come to me and say, I love what you do, but this is not for me. You know, I can do this alone. And or people that listen to what I have to say, but stay really quiet. They're just sort of like a sponge. They're absorbing it all, but they really feel so, I don't know, there is a sense of shame of losing your job. And they do not want to open up. And there is no better person to open up than somebody who, all I want is for you to get another job really, really quickly. Believe me, you know, it's good for my reputation. If you get a job really quickly, that's all I want. And I think it's really, it gives you permission to be vulnerable with somebody who wants the best for you, but not like your best girlfriend or friend, you know, somebody that will have some tough love and guidance and to coach you in the right direction and give you all the best advice to get you on your way to your new career or your new job. But some people are really reluctant to do that. They cocoon themselves. And they apply for jobs as if they were a factory of job applications at home, all alone. And they really miss a great opportunity, I think, to build their confidence, network, connect, get workshop ideas, and get to a next job quicker.
There's a couple of paradoxes in Brene's research, and one of the paradoxes is I consider when you show vulnerability as a strength. Well, how fantastic for Renata to be vulnerable, and how strong is she able, you know, to be able to do that. But then I consider vulnerability in me a weakness. So, you know, one of the things to think about is that, you know, when you have looked at other people and gone, wow, you know, how strong is he for demonstrating that vulnerability, to apply that to self as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's leave it at that. And, you know, the good thing about this platform is that if people, what we discussed before in the workplace environment, you know, if people feel like they have something that they are uncomfortable with and they want to unpack that in a private, safe environment, we have a private group. Great. This podcast has a private group for members only, and it's free. It's you sign up, and there's some rules that you have to abide for. If you are not following the rules, you're kicked out. I've only kicked out 2 people so far, so it's okay. And you can ask away, you can share your concerns, and there's lots of interesting people in there to answer and help you out. So if you're listening here and you want to unpack a situation, join the group. Dina, thank you so much for your time and your experience. I loved having you here.
Thank you for the opportunity. I love speaking courage, so I am very, very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this episode of the Job Hunting Podcast. This interview with Dina was such an interesting one for me. You can see how quiet I am. I was taking it all in and I learned so much from her. Please keep in touch, visit my website and check my free tools and resources for job hunters, career changers and career enthusiasts, as well as the Job Hunting Made Simple online course and my private coaching and other services that I offer. Most importantly, don't forget to subscribe to the Reset Your Career, which is my community, so that I can send you my weekly newsletter and all the perks and resources that I give all my community members. Please also follow me on social media, mostly Facebook and Instagram, where I post daily to help professionals who are job searching and looking to revamp their professional careers. I hope we keep in touch, and bye for now.